morning.
Morning.
We'll just wait a minute or two for a few people to join. It's a beautiful day here. So lovely. So I think I'll just start. Greetings from Tinaha Makas here where I am. First I wanted to start by thanking people for sending me questions, and I did have a read through some of the materials you guys are finding for the sort of future forecast things. But I think the questions really helped me to understand that I needed to go through the assignment and kind of explain myself. I might have been in a bit of a hurry last week. So that's where I wanted to start. I want to sort of emphasize some of the pieces that are how so basically kind of like how I read the assignment. So I'm going to read it. It's very long, but I think it includes some of the things. And then I want to, like I put in the class plan, I want to have more of a conversation around the kinds of things that you guys might try on the learning environment that we're trying to create here. So let me just, I'm gonna start recording because I know there's at least one person who said they were going to have to be late. So I just want to start. Oh, it started automatically. That's how I set the class up. I have to stop it. Okay. So we're recording, and whoever listens to the recording later will get to hear me fooling around with the Zoom. Okay, so let me just start sharing. I'm just going to share the assignment first, and then we'll get into, I think I'll just share the screen. Okay. So hopefully that's big enough text on your screen that you can just read it from the share. Put our pictures over there. So I'm trying to get us to write some scenarios that we're going to use later in the semester assignment, right? So, and I'm going to be explaining that a bit more, like what are these for, which I think will really help. So what have I said here? Each group will construct, which sounds like an ambitious thing, will construct and present a scenario for communities or a community in Northern BC in 2050. It can be regional, including Prince George, for the First Nations communities in Northern BC, or you may prefer to tell a story that is situated in one northern community. So I'm already bringing in the word story. Stories are better with particulars. So a scenario tells a story in narrative form. That means that's saying the same thing twice or possibly 3 times. It's a story. We're going to write stories. Scenarios do in things you read, they often will take the forms, well, sorry, scenarios could be science fiction, they could be fortune telling, that kind of story, because I'm trying to give you some form. Some are optimistic, some are pessimistic, some are kind of even-handed, but all present sort of how things are now, but the now is in a future time. We're going to use this galaxy rather than a galaxy far, far away, but it's going to be, you know, the year 2050 in this galaxy in northern BC. And that was a reference to one of the Star movies that I don't know much about. So a good scenario, and I'm just going to say story, but how would you tell if it was a good story? It's credible. You're going to kind of believe it. So you're going to base it in emerging trends, which that's what we have in our forecast document, in our shared files. That's going to be our starting point. We're going to base it in that and the forecasts that are available. So we might have a forecast about the future of work. We might have a forecast about some more structural economic change. Most forecasts are wrong. And so that's one of the reasons that I posted that Tony Seba video, is because he talks about forecasts and he talks about how hard it is to forecast from where you are even a couple of years into the future. We work on this on the community forest all the time in our different problems that we have, like, should we buy a mill for our community forest? Well, where's the lumber products industry going? Where are forest prices going? What's our sustainable supply of forestry, and what are our competing values? And, you know, it's sort of like we're always trying to look into the future in a very volatile price environment. So, okay, back to the assignment, sorry. I was just going to read it. Most forecasts are wrong because most forecasts project out from a couple of system drivers, and typically there's no way to handle the complexity of intersecting trends. So what do I mean by that? I posted an example of provincial population forecasting, which those of you in planning will have worked on population forecasting. So you know the method of how you forecast the population, and then you use drivers. You use drivers like birth and death and jobs. And Tara, read the assignment. Birth and death rates with migration between communities and internationally sort of coming to where the jobs are going to be. Even right now, the job locations don't predict where people are going to live. So the method of population forecasting, which we learn and we use, doesn't handle the complexity of remote work. For rural, northern, and remote communities, population projection is likely to predict depopulation, like lowering populations, whereas rural communities that have amenity, water, and internet are actually likely to attract people. There I go, writing a scenario. That's my swing at the cat. I think the future of rural populations is not one of population decline. Anyway, read the scenario, read the assignment. I have included a few scenarios that I've written to assist community groups in strategic planning for various purposes. So I put those in the shared Google Drive. I did a set of scenarios for sustainable healthcare. I did a set of scenarios for a public library strategic planning. And given the nature of the groups that I was working with, I didn't try to go very far in the future. I just tried to go a little ways. So, and this is a tricky part, the thing that I say, the first step, and that's what you would have had your conversations about last week. It's deciding what you want the stories to be relevant to. So we're on our way. We know that our project, our semester project, I know that anyway, is going to be considering what actions would hold up under a number of different possible futures. That's what resilience is. It's about, it's actually about what sustainability is. It's like this, if we do this, we'll be secure whether this happens or this happens or this happens, or we'll be more well off than we would if we did that. You know, it's a risk aversion kind of thing to realize that you don't know what's going to happen and try to choose the thing to invest in that does pretty well in a number of things that could happen. So you guys talked about community you'd like to work on, Prince George, or the issue like food security. So you did that. And then the next step is to collect forecasts that are kind of relevant to that interest. And in this case, we would want to collect forecasts of the systems that impact the communities of northern BC, and articles about emerging trends that might impact northern and rural communities. So if you have a look at that shared folder, I think we're coming along. I think one miscommunication would be that I said that we can't do without climate forecasts. So we've got water, wildlife, and the forest industry, food supply and security. We've got those, but we don't have, there's one on the city system, trying to understand the city system. I think we've kind of, we've over-focused in terms of the futures that we have collected on that. I only meant that at least one or two people in each group should find things. Anyway, we might need to be thinking a little farther out of the box, and that's one of the things that I'm hoping we can do today. Is think about some of those technological shifts, like are in the Tony Seba video that was assigned last week. Maybe the future of work. Oh yeah, I was just going to read through the assignment, wasn't I? It's simplest to start with the forecasts that are for northern BC. I'm going to skip a bit. Can't do without climate forecasts at this moment. So water, wildfire, forest industry, food supply and security. We've got some of those there. You guys did this. The first points part of the assignment is going to be for those resources. And while when I looked at it on Tuesday, I only saw 4. There were a bunch more there this morning. So we're pretty close on that. Yeah, we're still missing a few. So some of you still need to post a forecast, and some of you might want to, for your group, look for some more resources too. And feel free to post some more in the forecasts folder. I have gone through, I just can't do it, can I? I just can't read the assignment. Let me just say that I've gone through and made some comments and asked some questions in relation to those. One of the things that I think a student might worry about is whether, when I'm arguing with them, whether I'm also evaluating them or saying they did something wrong, which I don't perceive that I'm doing. I think that I'm like, okay, this is good. Let's stretch. Let's keep going. You know, I sort of, it might be hard to imagine that that's what I'm doing, because it might sound like I'm arguing, which to me it's like the Socratic method or something like that. Anyway, So I put a lot of comments on that page, and I want you to read them. And if you could just leave them there for other people to read, don't like check the thing that says you've dealt with them. Just leave my comments there. Hopefully that'll spark some imagination. So coming back to my aim of reading once through the assignment, I'm going to start again here, because I feel like this is where we are, and this is what I'd like to really talk about today. So with your group, write 1 or 2 scenarios. I find it soothing to write an optimistic scenario, but I also find it therapeutic to write a pessimistic one. I usually start with some of the forecast trends and system drivers that we imagine to be there right now. And then I imagine how a community might feel some of these interactions, or adapt to some, or react to others. And you can also start at the end of the story. You in your imagination, you have a resilient community, and you try to imagine this, the story from 2020 to 2050 of how it came to be how it is. So in either case, you're going to have to sort of incorporate a whack of little details about how this town, or how this place, or how this region has dealt with technological change and climate and the future of work. Anyway, so simply, the next assignment is to write a story with the end of the story set at 2050. If you get on a roll with being creative, the story can be a romance. We can have a tragic hero, or any of the other what I call shapes of stories that we like to listen to. As a scenario, it needs to give us enough detail that we know what that future is like. So it really is a story, and it really is imaginative. So I just want to change over. Oh, I've moved this little guy in the wrong place. Some of the background, some of my big ideas for giving you this kind of assignment. Stories. Because, like, why a story? Why such a everyday kind of communication? I'm going to start with a story. So I had a meeting last week with the politician, because I have been working really hard on affordable housing, on securing funding, everything from site comparison to site evaluations to environmental review to I want us to get secure affordable rental housing in Caslo. And so I was meeting with one of the candidates, and I got this little half hour all to myself. I was pretty pleased, and so I give her the overall, give her the data, what's the median income, and how 60% of the population of Caslo wouldn't be able to afford a house if they moved here now, or some of them have bought houses when they were less expensive, and how frequently younger people have to move, and how we're losing young people from the community because they can't find housing. And I gave her the numbers on those things and what the Caslo Housing Society had been doing. And I just went blah, 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 data. Like, I didn't put up charts, but I could have. And then I went to a meeting later where the candidate talked to the community, and she mentioned housing, and she did not mention median income, not even once. She said, I met with Tara to talk about housing, and then I went for a walk down Main Street, and I met a woman in one of the stores that had had to move 9 times in the last year. And I'm like, how have I still not learned my own lesson that stories are important? Because that communicates the situation of, most of the young people in Caslo are having to move so frequently, if they can find another place at all. Anyway, so I'm like, how do I not know that I should have told the story? So, this assignment is about, first of all, the fundamental importance of storytelling in human communication, and it's about imagination. My other story is I ran into a military guy yesterday, just retired out of the military, and I had forgotten that the method of strategic planning, the method of scenario planning, prior to its, in its intellectual history, it actually comes out of the military and then becomes a form of corporate planning before it ever hits the planning sector and the community sector and social services. So he was just talking about moving to the area, and he just referred to what he learned about walking in the bush from his time in the military. He said, if you can imagine it, it could happen. And that's military training. So that's what we're kind of trying to do here, is trying to imagine. And I know it's maybe not what you are used to trying to do in a school class, right? Like, here I am in school, I need to be accurate, or I need to be the other things that you typically have to be in school, accurate. And no, this little bit, I'm asking you to imagine. So there's one of the risks, and one of the things that people often do with scenario planning in the nonprofit sector, in the community sector, in planning, is they often forget that the scenarios are supposed to be things that could happen. They're not supposed to be all about things they wish would happen. And so that's really the challenge. So I'll just continue, because with the big brain, so why the story form? For one thing, like my example about the politician shows, stories are things that people really get. So if you are committed to the idea that you should be able to communicate with other people, you need to be able to tell stories. That's supported by some humanities policy research that I could give you a bunch of citations. I think that the key point is that this ability that you have as a human being could be dusted off for serious purpose. The other thing, if you think about how stories can often give you a window, just generally, stories can give you a window into someone else's view of the world, which, if you're committed to working diversely, is you can't do without it. I'm just thinking, First Nations communities have people in the community that have the responsibility for their stories. It's I mean, not all the time, but often. And I was listening to one of the Tanaha storytellers talk about, it's the story of how the Tanaha people came to be here. And I'm not going to try to tell this story, but in the progress of telling the story, which is a wonderful story, it takes about 20, 30 minutes to tell, but it communicates the entire landscape and the place names and the seasonal round, how the people are in relation to the land, as well as how they come to be. So as a community story, it situates us in relation to the land and gives us the whole map of the territory. So if I wanted to understand how the Tanaha, what their territory was and how they related to the land, I can listen to that story, and I can really listen to that story. So, that's stories, and there's stories in other cultures. We need to be able to listen to other people's stories, and then we'll learn a lot. So stories, just as a method in planning, as a method in community work, stories are a core method. They're not statistics, but they are a core method. They're a method of democracy, they're a method of diversity, and they're a method of humanity. So if I were to ask you if you were a good storyteller or not, which is what's my, so I want you to think about, what is my competence as a storyteller now? And I've already shared with you that sometimes I forget to tell stories when I ought to tell stories in certain situations. I have just my life experience, I have a set of stories that I have kind of worked up and I enjoy telling them, but they're not ones that I would tell in this position of being the professor. But just kind of think about this. Do you have a story? A story that you could sort of share with the class or share with your group, like that sort of communicates something about yourself or who you are in relation to the place, or if you think about it, you already tell these stories. Because why am I saying this? Because I'm asking you to do something that you're probably not you don't think you're used to doing. And that can be a risk. That's a risky behavior. And so I'm asking you to take a risk. Another risk, you've already drawn pictures with crayons and paint, and now I'm asking you to tell a story. So I'm hoping that we can all generously proceed together. I already mentioned the role of stories in public, but if you get, if you're listening at all to the political campaign that's going on now here or abroad, you will often hear politicians using stories. One of the theorists that I read, that I use in my research, just uses politicians as an example, and he says, you so often will hear a politician saying, I was a farmer myself, or they'll say, I was born and raised here. They're looking for ways to connect through stories. Community stories are another type of story. If you were to look on the website of a community, most communities will tell their history, and they do it in a kind of a selective way, which, if you're looking at the world in a deconstructive way, you're like, oh yeah, sure, but they didn't mention this part of their history or this part of their history. And that is very culturally present right now, is an argument over, there's an argument over stories, there's an argument over representation. And why is that? That's because those stories help us importantly understand who we are and whether or not we have a, do I have a right to be here? What's my place here? Who am I in relation to my history? Do I come from a long line of good people, or maybe I don't? And so they're very fundamental community stories, and that's at the municipal level, a community story, or sort of the more smaller cultural level. Often friendship groups will have like a community story, a sort of a creation story. And so I've been working in the area of the role of stories in planning and public policy. So one of the simple arguments is that if you want to be effective in making change, you need to be an effective storyteller. And I think you've probably all seen or experienced the difference between someone who can effectively tell a story along with their data, because there's a balance here when you're in planning and public policy. Can you tell an effective story with your data that connects people to each other? That is, that's the end goal. Telling stories with our data, not just being able to understand our data. So why do I think these stories are important for the future? I should follow my own outline. So what I'm saying, what are we supposed to be able to know about the future? If you think back to the before times, when the world was a different place. So I'm talking about January. When I'm talking, thinking about January, we all had lives that we were expecting to go one way, or, they were kind of on a path. And then we've had a pandemic. And how much have our assumptions changed since January? Like, I think our world has shifted since January. Could we have imagined in January or a year ago, a full year ago, that this is what school would be like right now? And the answer is both yes and no, because it's some people's jobs to imagine that. And fortunately, there were people who had imagined a pandemic scenario and had put certain things in place. And fortunately, we are very fortunate to have some of those people in a position where they could put some of those actions in place. What do those people do when there's not a pandemic? On the other hand, how imaginative are you comfortable being? And how fast can you let go of things that aren't true anymore? And so to me, imagination is a really important tool in this world that we're in. And part of that is because it changes so quickly. I know it, I'm saying that to you guys who are all having just experienced some very radical changes. And I'm saying, last year, you were wrong about the future, I would guess. So welcome to the world of being wrong. And one thing that I can tell you about your scenarios and about the forecasts is that they're wrong. some way. I'm wrong. Those forecasts are wrong. You guys are wrong. Cool. So what do we have for tools? And this is what we're working on in this class. What do we have for tools to help us with the many ways we are wrong? So I think it's fun. And I know it's maybe a bit of a culture shift, but I think it's super fun to be wrong. So let's say we're just going to agree that the future is not what you think it will be, and we're going to go ahead and write these stories about it. We can't really expect things to go forward in straight lines, and I know this is getting almost, when we talk about the future, some people use projections, other people use almost spiritual forms, and so I might be kind of trespassing there. But I know that I've tried manifesting things, and my record on manifesting things is spotty. Sorry. It's a little bit, it's like, what do we do about the future? So we just try to be open to and imagine some things. And what I want you to use in this assignment is your basic and unexpected competence in storytelling. I have just said that storytelling is a fundamental feature of human communication. And so if that's true, you must all do it all the time. And so I got some things like, you didn't tell us this was supposed to be a story, and comments like that. No, it really is supposed to be a story. So suggested scenario titles. So when I was thinking about when you last had to write a story in school, like I don't know when that would be, but you might have written what I did last summer in school, or a very long time ago, you might have written what I got for Christmas. And so there you go, 2 titles of your 2050 scenarios of stories that you've already written, except they weren't in 2050. So I'm going to just stop the recording here for a sec. Actually, does anybody have any questions that they might want to share before I stop the recording?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure, Hannah.
So yeah, I just like listening to kind of all the stuff you've laid out. Like I definitely got from the beginning that the intent was for this to be a story. I guess like where my I'm either like I'm not saying something right or I'm missing something, because what I feel like I've put forward, or our group has put forward as a proposal, like fits what it is that you're asking. Like our idea was that we create a future scenario that a food system exists within, and then we tell a short story from each segment of that population. And so I don't, because you were saying that that's not kind of what you're asking for, and I don't understand what it is you're asking for if that's not correct.
Sure. So like, assuming that I don't understand your full design.
Yeah.
But let me share some of my full design.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do with these scenarios is everybody's going to use them. In other words, we're going to proceed to the next step of our assignment, and each group is going to have a set of, say all the groups write 2 scenarios, then everybody is going to have 8 scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So those stories are what I need them to do. This is different from what I need them to do or what the class needs them to do. is tell a story in such a way that communicates what the future is like. So if, say, okay, so we're talking about a food supply, basically a food system story, right? So if you wrote it, if your group was to write maybe two food system stories, so that, see, it's what I'm hearing from what you say is that it'll be essentially one story about food security from 5 different people's perspectives, which means I think it's going to be the same future from 5 different points of view. Is that?
I mean, if the requirement is 2 scenarios, that like sort of 2 worlds can be created, like 2 different scenarios. Like one is that Prince George, say, is a desert, and how water is distributed and like through lottery system, and then how that plays out on a food system. Or maybe the other one is Prince George becomes a tropical zone where we can grow lemons and limes and become a breadbasket for BC or something like that. And then the stories kind of that exist within that. So I guess like kind of the idea behind like having the different scenario, like the different players in the food system, because there's 5 people in a group, for all of us to be able to contribute to it in a way that doesn't like step too much on each other's toes or whatever, but we all can contribute something. So I guess, yeah, like where I'm getting stuck is like I see that as exploring the scenario of Prince George in 2050, and as being
If part of it might be a way you'd like to do things organizationally. So if your group would rather write 5 different stories, that would actually work better. So
Okay.
then you can all go away and write like a story where you're creating a world, and so you don't have to have a group meeting, and you're not all trying to, the rest of us don't just get one really complicated story. The rest of us get actually 5 different imaginations of the future. That would actually be fantastic if that's a sort of an organizational problem that you're trying to solve. The risk is to have 2 what am I saying? Well, when I think about a story about food insecurity or food security, I think it's a fantastic topic, because to me it allows you to bring in there's reading through those resources. We're looking at more frost-free days and higher temperature and still a relatively abundant supply of water in the summer relative to other regions of the world. The thing is, beyond that, there's a whole bunch of other things that are going to change really quickly, including where are people wanting to live, and how do people work, and that sort of economic stuff. So I just don't want you to write a story that focuses in on how we currently perceive food insecurity as an issue. Is that making sense?
Well, I mean, what I think we kind of talked about in the group is to sort of decide on a future scenario based on predictions or 2 different scenarios, and then collectively sort of decide, okay, like maybe this could be the way that people get food tickets in the future, or like how food is distributed or how much water is distributed, and and then create each of our little story, like our short stories of each person. Like the farmer, like Farmer Joe gets up and checks his lottery for food or for water usage this day, and is able to like do this. I don't know, just like so it lives in a future scenario, but it is like goes throughout this, like throughout each person that is part of that system. So it still is looking at a future scenario, and we can decide on what that scenario is. So yeah, maybe more people move to print storage because it is more abundant for water and places to live. But maybe it's drier, so like more people are moving even more north. I don't know, like I'm
Well,
yeah.
I actually think it's a little bit harder than what the actual assignment is, but
I guess maybe one
if
way
you
to
guys
like,
want to, you know, I'm like at this point, if you guys would rather write 5 stories, then or you know, and try to attach them together. I think just trying to make them all 5 coherent with one view of how food systems will work in the future sounds very hard to me.
I mean, because I guess like the way that I imagine it functions, like we can kind of decide on a broad sense of a future scenario, and then go to our computers, write our quick stories about each one, and then we could submit them all back together and kind of review them together and decide like, oh, that seems like way off topic, or it kind of like write them separately but edit it together. That doesn't seem too.
So here's my question for your group. Are you going to decide that this is the way that you want things to happen, and you're going to suggest that we all invest in making that future happen?
Like in writing the story or in actual life?
Like, is that the direction your story is going? Is that the way you want things to happen, or is that a possible future?
I mean, I was like, I mean, I can't speak for everyone else, but I was thinking that by using different predictors, like I have some stuff about some predictions for food growing in the Okanagan, just because it's harder to find information for up in the Prince George area, but like using climate predictions, which there's stuff for PG, and then food production predictions for BC, like that's kind of telling a story what could be 2050. So not necessarily what I'd like to see food systems, because I have a lot of opinions of what I'd like to see, but using those predictions to what could be.
Okay, so as long as it's a story, that's my bottom line. As long as it's a story about what could be, and not necessarily the thing that you're going to aim your final project towards making happen.
Yeah.
Then I'm good. Do you mind if I answer Patrick?
Yeah, and Patrick's in my group as well.
Oh, good, cool.
Yeah.
That'll be useful.
Yeah.
That'll be all on the same topic. Patrick?
Hey, yeah.
Sorry, different Patrick.
It sounds like not everybody is taken EMPL 206.
Right.
Mark like really covered this in depth of the purpose of scenario planning and like how to get there, how to basically like there's a pretty clear cut formula to how to piece these scenarios together to come to something that is like a coherent story that does have some focus. So I'm just wondering if like we're able to get some of those resources. I actually like within our group just shared the resources from Mark's class that break down like how you map out the certainties, uncertainties. You create like, it sounds like what we're doing here is creating like one of say the 4 scenarios that you would I mean compared to Mark's class. So and we're going to kind of piece them together, but that process is still helpful in understanding, I mean, the purpose of scenario planning and how you create these. I mean, in that case, 4 different stories that kind of give you like an idea of what the future is going to be like. So
well,
long way of getting to somewhere. Can we get some resources that kind of map that out? It's like fill in the blanks, and then you have your paint by numbers sort of thing when it comes to planning, and you have your main components, your certainties, uncertainties, and then the stories just evolve from that, right?
I might diverge a little bit from Mark on what I think the method might be.
Yeah, and I get that. And I don't want to like, not saying that there's only one way to do it. I didn't want to sound like that. I don't want to offend you either. I didn't mean that. I just mean like there was like, it was a lower level class too. So it kind of really just simply put it down into like, here's one way of doing it that might, something similar, like even a Google link or something like that, that might kind of help visualize sort of the process of coming up with these scenarios, right? Like, because
Well,
it's
I
not
would
necessarily intuitive to everybody, right? And especially people that may not have taken Mark's class are
Right.
kind of like, wait, we're supposed to take these trends and make a story. Like it doesn't,
Right.
if you take in that class, it's, oh yeah, okay, we've done this before. But if you haven't, it's a little like, wait, what? Like, what are we supposed to do? So maybe some like visuals to go along with what you're saying might be useful is all I'm
Um,
really trying to get at.
I'm willing to like, so show of hands, how many people watched Tony Seba's video? Okay.
I don't know how to do the hand, but I am doing it in real life.
Okay. Okay, so quite a few. So Patrick said the method, there's a method for scenario construction. You start out with what you're certain about, and then what are you uncertain about? And it's almost like the things you know, the things you don't know, the things you know you don't know, and then there's the things you don't know, right? There's that set of ideas. So think about that. Just think about Tony Seba's video for a minute and think about those two pictures of New York City. In 1908, there's the picture, all the horses, one car. In 1913, all the cars, one horse. Now, if you think of yourself, deciding where to go to school in 1907, you might have decided to go to school in Belgian horse breeding. You might have decided to go to school in buggy whip manufacture. You might have decided to get a good job, like in horse carriage, trades, because it seemed fundamentally obvious to you, like it would to most of us, that, I mean, what better way could there be than to have a transportation that was reliant on sunshine and grass? So if you listen to people talk right now, in this province, and this is what some of the comments that I put, because I argue about this stuff. We've been a forest industry province, more or less, for a long time. And so we tend to think about the forest industry rather than thinking about what's the service, or what's the contribution, or whatever. We're like it's almost like we're thinking about our buggy whip plant or whatever. We're thinking that we know that British Columbia has forests, and that forests are going to be fundamental to our economy. And then when you sort of, well, actually, it's a lot of our forest goes to fiber. And so there's that, the role that fiber plays in the global economy is a little bit different. A lot of our forest goes to building materials. And, I read one of those reports that talked about housing starts in the United States. It talks about, you know, the sort of indicators for building products. So to me, that's an uncertainty, because I look at demographic change and I think, well, we probably have all the single family houses that we're going to need. And some of that is just based on, because I do a lot of futures thinking. And am I really expecting you guys to sort of read every trend and think about all that stuff? Well, no. So you can use a method where you'll, you know, we're certain about this. Actually, if that's gonna make you guys feel more confident, I have no argument with presenting that as a method. What I'm really just wanting you to do is just use your imaginations. Now that is not methodological. And can you guys like shoot out some ideas? Let's try being imaginative. And I'll just start with a food example, which I did email. So, you know, I've read a lot of this global climate stuff, or let me start with the story. So we've had biodiversity collapse and we've lost our pollinators, and we had no idea what the effect of that was going to be on the food system, she said, munching on her jellyfish sandwich. All we have to eat now is jellyfish. You know, try to imagine what happens if we lose the pollinators. Then we lose a lot of the food, completely changes. So it's a really dynamic world. Ryan, Ryan.
Yeah. Sorry, I did have a question with regards to with the creativity aspect of it, because I'm a person who really enjoys writing and being creative with my writing. And so I guess I'm sort of having a bit of a hard time wrapping my head around the difference between just writing up a scenario and also then writing up a story. Because when I think of writing up a story, like, it just takes me so long. And so I just wonder, given that, you know, it's due next week, like, is there some sort of length that we can kind of orient ourselves around that will maybe sort of help people identify how they want their story to go? Because I mean, like, even just like throwing out an example to you, like, I was thinking of like, oh wow, like, what if we told the story from the perspective of a black bear who goes into hibernation and wakes up and it's like 2050, you know? So it's like, how far can we go with stuff like that, and how long does it have to be? Because to constrain myself sometimes is really hard.
Let me just. So when I was thinking about this assignment and how fun it was going to be, put up these assignments, and I thought they would be like, you know, I sort of imagined the scenarios to be about this length. And so let me just share the screen for a sec, because I think I'm actually trying to ask you guys, like not to overthink this, right? So admittedly, my first scenario, so I wrote these scenarios for Caslo and I kind of set them in 2025, right? And now this one I wrote oh, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, I wrote this scenario set. So it was not an uncomparable amount of time out. So if you look at the length of this one, it's about a page. And what I was trying to do was with this one takes, what would happen if we had a lot more, you know, the rainfall, the meltwater scenario changes. Well, that impacts infrastructure. If you think about one of the examples somebody put on was tornadoes. So we have across the province, you know, there's a lot of provinces continually having to come in and backstop infrastructure. And so is Fortis. I mean, last week, or sorry, the first class when I was on the Zoom, there were 163 trees down on the lines between like Nelson and Castle. So once you get an increased frequency of these events, what happens? Do you have to invest all your money in infrastructure, or do you start to pull back in terms of where you're maintaining your core infrastructure? So this one was just a question about this backwater scenario was like, what happens when the province has to start pulling back from its infrastructure investments? So it's actually got a very simple 2-trend base, little climate change, a little public investment. So, and then how does that affect Caslo? This one, again, I'm usually just focusing in on a couple of things, a couple of trends when I write these stories. This one's a new economy story. And if you think about how that new economy stuff is taking place in the north, people are talking right now about how important it is to invest in infrastructure, in information infrastructure. And right now in 2020, we're suddenly realizing that the remote work is a thing. So it wouldn't take very long before our centralized, maybe our centralized workplaces, our centers of economy, which are cities, maybe they're going to disperse geographically, right? So if you just focus in on that trend and a little climate change, because if you think about Patrick's method, at least we know there's going to be some climate change. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but we know that it's going to present a number of challenges that have been written out, right? So if you just focus in your story on how people make a living, and just spend some time thinking about how that might change. Remember, I'm expecting you to not be right, and it might be, actually, I'm just thinking about Ryan's example. I'm thinking about a bear story. I could definitely write a bear story because we've had such enormous losses in our fish population here that the bears have some stories to tell, both the grizzlies and the black bear. I wrote a big tourism scenario because that was an issue that was not at the time settled. One of the ones that might be a fun dimension is what happens with education. But I like to have it like two sort of things that I'm thinking about and then play with. So that's what I mean. They can be dark, they can be what I did last summer. If you want to sort of communicate the like, you know, I'm basing this on this, and I'm basing it on this trend and this trend. you can add a bit of discourse. It might be too hard to try to do these as groups. And that might be the part that's hard. Patrick? You have a little hand up.
Oh, it's probably because it never went away.
Ah.
Shouldn't be there. Yeah, I don't have a current question.
Okay. Can I ask you if this is a little bit more helpful?
For me, yeah, no, like I'm pretty clear on like what we need to do for this, but it just seemed like a lot of questions and stuff like that. I just was putting the idea out that maybe some sort of like format might help. Some sort of like, I know you're diverging from what we learned before, which is great. But like just like I
Do
just
you
said,
have
it's not necessarily intuitive for everybody by the sounds of it. So maybe just some sort of like something. I'm like okay with what we're doing. It's pretty clear and straightforward for me.
do you
But
have
like,
a resource from that class that Mark used? Like, because it just
yeah, actually, I took pictures of I don't have a digital copy. I have a paper copy, which I took pictures of and posted it in our Slack channel. But I can share
can we
that.
share that on
Yeah, I'll have to post pictures in chat because the photos are on my phone. Just give me a sec. Oh shoot, how am I going to do that?
can we post the pictures to the Google Drive, and we'll call it one way you can approach this more methodically.
Yeah, it's like not all of it needs to apply. It's just kind of like if people are kind of spinning their wheels about how to get going, it's just kind of there's that kind of grid format where you just kind of write out a few things and then you piece it together from there. So where do you want me to post it? I'll have to do it from my phone.
Let's do it to, is it okay if we post it at the bottom of forecast links as long as we all know where it is?
Sure,
I'll
yeah,
just
just
put
give
a
me a
title in there.
sec. I should be able to get it from my phone here. Yeah, just give me a sec here. Thanks.
And I will say, if you choose to do this method, it as if I'm understanding what Patrick said and looking and those resources, it will likely make better use of the forecasts that we have, whereas Tara's imaginative method, you might only be able to, use sort of one or two trends, but you might go a lot of different directions. That's Tara's method.
I think that's a really good method. I can speak for myself and I say though, like creative writing isn't necessarily a super strong suit for me. So I
Right.
kind of like for me, I need a little more. So I need that a little more that format to kind of at least get going. Kind of the concept sometimes of just taking a few ideas and rolling with it and writing a cool scenario that's more narrative. I mean, it's hard for me, and it just based on some of the comments, it kind of seemed like that might be a challenge for other people. So like,
I
that's
think
all I
this
was
is
really
great.
suggesting is that kind of there's a different method that's more fits a specific mold, which isn't perfect for everybody, but it might help people that kind of are like might find the freedom a little challenging, which for me it's a bit challenging at times. So that's I didn't want to be like, oh, like you got to do it this way because that's what somebody else said. Like absolutely not. It was just like
No, but
kinda
I'm happy to do this because I know, it's it can be a little intimidating. Just like Just like me asking you to draw the pictures with the crayons, that's also a little out there. And engages different parts of your brains that, you know, might be rusty. I like his screen name right now, Anonymous Dumbo Glacier. I think that's fun.
Okay, I apologize. I'm trying to do it from my phone and it's not working. So just see if I can pull it right from the doc.
The other thing is you can, oh yeah, you just have the pictures. Do you have a citation for it? Because I could probably locate it with a citation.
I don't know.
Okay, well let's just assume that we're going to be able to use those pictures. For those of you that would like a way to get into this, like Patrick has expressed, that's fine. And Ryan, you had asked how long, or I'm actually thinking about single page, page and a half.
Okay, that works. Thank you.
What do you guys think people will be eating in 2050?
Soylent Green.
Potatoes. I actually, Dr. Clapp, when you mentioned the pollinator thing, I was like, oh my God, like that's something I didn't even think about. And actually, as you were talking, I opened Google and I Googled it. I was like, what is some stuff we can grow without pollinators? And yeah, it came up with like potatoes and radishes and those sort of like tubers. And I was like, oh, we actually can grow like a decent amount. So, the PG breadbasket scenario might still be alive, but yeah, I don't know. It was interesting that you mentioned that because honestly, I didn't even think about it. Like Patrick said, I'm kind of like a robot. I'm a more like non-creative person. So yeah, I look at the trends and I'm like, oh, these are trends, but I'm not like too imaginative,
When you read, so I was looking at one of it's a really useful one. I mean, these are all great. How come my comments have all disappeared? Oh, they're there. Where is this? Maybe this is I probably have more than one thing open on this. Anyway, one of these is a regional climate forecast for Prince George. I'm like, yes. And then you get in there and it's all tables, and I don't know how to read the acronyms at the top of the tables, and so it's hard for me. It's like, oh, damn. But it did have, 6 degree, an approximately 6 degree rise in temperature, the low end warmer than the, more movement on the low end in the winter than the top end, and wetter in the summer, that kind of stuff. One of the resources that I listen to around here is there's a local ecologist that has taken those sort of more local regional climate scenarios and looked at what the forest classifications that they relate to. And so, speaking of bears, we'll probably lose the huckleberry ecosystem, which here is where it's the food source that is most used currently by maternal grizzly bears. So if you lose the huckleberry unit, I mean, and we've already lost a lot of the fish population, how do mama grizzlies raise little baby grizzly bears? So it's sort of like, I haven't seen one of those for the north, but I found that so much easier to picture when he was saying, you know, the temperatures with a fairly high degree of certainty, temperature and precipitation are going to make summers in this region kind of like the ponderosa pine kind of climate that's currently around Boise, Idaho. I mean, I can picture that. Don't like it, but I can picture it. So it would be nice to have some of those more things. But yeah, sorry, back to the pollinators, Cameron. That's what I mean about certainties. We read all this stuff about the bees, the bee die-offs, and you know, what are those nicotinoids? Is that the pesticide that might be leading to the bee die-offs? And then there's a certain amount of climate change, what's going to happen with all the pollinators. There's a lot of uncertainty in that. There are cultures where pollination is you know, people are out pollinating by hand. I know that we've had a few ups and downs in the bee population here, and my dad is out with the zucchinis and a Q-tip, right? So yeah, pollinators are a thing, and I think they might be an international issue, but I don't know, I don't know when.
Yeah, it's one of those trends that as soon as you mentioned it, I thought like, oh, well, duh, I've been reading this headline in newspapers for the last 5 years, right? But it's something that you don't see when you read like those provincial, municipal city reports, right? Like they're a lot less imaginative. In fact, I was a little disappointed actually. Like I had my report, and my report referenced another report that someone else linked, and maybe I just didn't go in depth enough, but I was a little disappointed in like their vulnerabilities and opportunities. I thought it wasn't very imaginative. It was like, well, yeah, there's big implications for roads because thaw and dethawing cycles. It's going to cost more, and yeah, maybe we'll have to spend less on heating. But there was one thing they mentioned, which I was surprised, but it wasn't even in that section of the report. It was buried in another section, and it was like, oh, PG might become like a more agricultural hub. And I was like, wow, really? And I even put that in my thing, so I was so shocked, right? But I was a little disappointed with I don't know. I thought it was very conservative, I guess. And I'm kind of bad at like finding those really interesting trends, right? I totally forgot about the bees, right? So.
Just think, there's room for, there's room for the imaginative. And it's really difficult when you're working, and this is one of the things about doing this here now, because when you are working, if you're working in a municipal environment, it's very difficult to be imaginative. It's because the thought structure is often tied to the budget. Here's where our property taxes come from, and here's what we have to spend money on. So those are our central areas of attention. And it's sometimes difficult to sort of link out from that, especially because you don't want to be perceived as loony. I'm just going to try to find a Prince George thing that I decided to back off from giving you a bunch more stuff to read this week. I thought I better just let you focus on your stories. But I had found some nice Prince George images that I'd like to share. Where are we? I can't even read my own file structure here. It always takes my computer a minute to bring images. I probably need to get a new computer. Come on, come on. Oh, it's never going to load. So let me just start with, so here's, and I need to make these a little bit bigger. Okay. Boy, this is difficult mapping to read. This is from a study a few years ago. Now, have you guys worked with this study in other classes right now? This is a new 200-year floodplain.
Isn't this the one that has guided a lot of the bylaws for new building codes in Prince George, like having to be above the floodplain?
So what's the current discussion on what happens with this neighborhood here?
That's like the 100 or 200 like big flood that occurs. That's like the blue area is basically showing what gets flooded, pretty sure.
Yeah. But I mean, property taxes, infrastructure.
Oh, like specifically that area. That's a really
Are we
like
just gonna, are we
low-
gonna build a little fence?
No, like as I think it was Hannah was saying, like there's newer building requirements for those areas. So buildings have to be built above the floodplain, which means building them above grade most of the time. Any upgrades have to fit those requirements too, which is actually also a challenge because that's also why a lot of buildings aren't being upgraded because of the expense. There's a whole bunch of issues there with accessibility as well. Because that's another thing. If anybody's doing renovations in a building, they have to be updated to the new building code. So it has to meet the floodplain requirement, has to meet accessibility requirements. So often they're just not being upgraded, which degrades the downtown. There's a number of other things too, I think, for building in the floodplain. So one of the things they were doing, which was done with Park House, was that they put parking. So below grade parking was one way to get around that. So the building essentially, that's why it's built on top of a parkade, is to mitigate that flood risk. And yeah, there's a whole slew of stuff, that policy stuff that has to do with the floodplain.
So have you guys ever heard, so I'm just gonna talk about imagining here for a sec. So there's also there's a thing called brownfields, where you have an environmental contamination site, and it'd be very important before you reuse that site to have that cleaned up. So they make that rule. And what happens then, just like I would imagine that this new floodplain, when you imagine what happens when you, okay, well, if you're going to build here, you have to meet all these new regulations. One of the things that some people are going to do is just not do those things. Like they're just going to use the building until it's past its usefulness and then walk away, because it will have very low value because of the level of investment you have to put in it. So in a way, when you have to change a floodplain, it changes the, property tax, land value, because when you have to put $1 million into this in order to use it again, that's a negative $1 million, bam. So it takes a while for these things to work in, but in 2050, these neighborhoods are going to be a heck of a lot more dense. So if you were looking for agricultural opportunities in the city of Prince George, maybe there's some conversions here that could happen. That's what I mean by look at something, think it through, and think, oh, that would be fun to imagine. The thing about this that's so funny is it's so much of the downtown. So there the investment might be made. But here around that, I think that is charmingly called something or other slough, right? But this is just a sort of a single family house neighborhood. Is this, I forget what that is. I've driven around using gasoline, these neighborhoods. But
Those
this
are the,
one, pardon me?
sorry, what you were pointing to, those are like the baseball parks along Massey, like by the Y and where they're building.
Yeah, it's Massage Place.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. One thing that
Perfect.
actually I noticed stands out is that the rail yard is all underneath the floodplain as well. So
Rail yards are
There's-
more or less flood resilient though, aren't they?
yeah, but the stuff that usually sits there isn't. So like we're talking about rail cars full of oil and diesel fuel, grain, like any number of things that get shipped by rail. Essentially all that stuff is going to flow through the downtown, through this residential area, back through this slough. So to think about, like, in terms of disaster mitigation, sure, all those buildings might just get washed away and then they'll have to rebuild them, but there's going to be significant contamination of most of the downtown and a huge part of a residential area in the event of a massive flood, by the looks of it.
And then what happens to that salmon population? I think there's still salmon in the downstream river, yeah?
Yeah, the runs are really bad this year, actually, though. So, like, I think only 5% returns from the last run. So, yeah, it would be devastating in a lot of ways, right? So, and
So
not to
listen
mention
to
those
us
rail yards have been
imagining.
there for 100 years, right? So the ground's really contaminated there. I mean, there have been floods, but a massive flood, there's a lot of contaminated soil there. It's like 100 years of contaminated ground that
Mhm.
would basically flow into the river and much of the downtown.
So we're imagining, Patrick and I, anybody else want to play?
I say we extend Cottonwood Island Park across that northern boundary, and we use that as a sort of natural marshy wetland flood barrier. And there you go. There's an example of a resilient downtown.
We could, yeah, a lot of flood prone places look at this kind of scenario and they decide we're going to build some dikes. If you look at how Winnipeg has dealt with its flood, you know, they built the floodway in the 60s and they just reinvested. And so, you know, lots of places build dikes.
But I think too, like for Prince George, a lot the flooding mostly happens in the winter from ice blocks. So you're having to factor in like it being a winter condition, not necessarily like 100-year flood in the summer. Like that's when the 2008 flood happened. It was from an which the river, the Nechako, got pretty backed up this winter as well. And there's some minor flooding along in some of the lower parts of that floodplain along the river.
And then there's also the infrastructure related flooding, which is one of the groups worked on last year. I had a slightly different assignment, but if we could imagine a situation in which the city was either struggling to invest in expanding its stormwater infrastructure to meet the new rain thing. I know that doesn't sound like a fun romance. Maybe that's how I met my partner. You know, I'm writing for you from 2050. I met my partner while we were working on the new stormwater system. Sorry, but if you think about that intersection of how much this kind of adjustment, just this, is going to cost, versus other competing demands like the stormwater infrastructure and the rest of the urban fabric, maybe that contracts the footprint of the city back to as they're trying to do, or maybe people with their new remote work, they don't want the tax burden of this, so they just move. That's what anyway, there's such a, this is why I find infrastructure so fascinating. I think it's fascinating to decide how should you invest this is a very short time horizon. How should you invest? How should you, try to mitigate that kind of contamination? A lot of flood prone communities do some combination of diking and wetland enhancement. So when you're making that investment, where does your tax base come from? How are you incorporating the new economy? How are you attracting remote workers whose jobs are located all over the world so that you can make this a beautiful and delightful community? So I think the thing that I like about using visuals like this for Ryan's point of view, because to me, when I have a picture, I can start imagining. It's so much easier than when I have a graph. And if you think about back to my stuff about how do you communicate with other human beings, it's a similar kind of thing. Like how do you help people imagine that future? Because Cameron's point about the city of Prince George, where is he? I think this is what he was talking about, because I was looking at this too. Here we go. Here's the adaptive actions. So they've looked at some features and they thought these are our resilient actions. So this is like what you're going to do for the semester project. You're going to figure out some adaptive actions. These are Prince George has done this assignment and this is their list of actions. It's actually got some interesting elements in it, like encourage local agriculture. It's very focused on the city budget right here, as you would expect. This part, economic diversification, not very specific about that. What do I imagine Prince George should do? Get decent internet anywhere they want people to live. To me, that's like the key infrastructure. Go ahead, Cameron.
Sorry, I disconnected from Zoom and I reconnected, and then I see you're right in the middle of looking at my thing, and I'm like, oh my gosh. Yeah, I purposely tried to be very simple because I was like, man, I'm writing a summary of this and I'm already like half a page. Let me not just write everything, right? So so economic diversification, I don't even remember exactly what they were saying, but I tried to just be abstract, right? So try not to use up too much space. But I do agree with you.
Oh, maybe they are talking about their role in information infrastructure is what you're saying.
It might have been. I can't quite remember. I'd have to go look at it.
Okay. So you guys, it's 1:03 and I should be letting you meet with your groups, right? Does anyone want to try an imagining thing and see if I say no, that's too wacky?
I had the like the tsunami risk forecast.
Uh-huh.
Could I like kind of pose my idea and then you could tell me either how to adapt it or if I'm a little bit too far off for like my story idea sort of thing.
Here's we are. Here we are at tsunamis. Do you want to play with tsunamis or tsunamis and something else?
Yeah, I don't know. My idea was kind of more like the forecast, the scenario would be like this community that has had its supply chain like disrupted by the tsunami in a major way.
Exactly
And
what
kind
I
of
was thinking.
like playing on that idea of like a community that like if you read their OCP, they would say that they've been practicing like sustainability and resilience, but like it's kind of only on a surface level, like they buy their, you know, solar panels on Amazon sort of situation. So when like an actual big disruption does happen, like the tsunami, and like and they have to face the effects of that, like I don't know where I'm going from there, but I think you can kind of get the idea of what I'm kind of going for, of like seeing the effects of like preaching sustainability and resilience but not practicing. Does that make sense?
Well, it's kind of a key for most of our city systems. The supply chains introduce the most interesting set of vulnerabilities because in so much of our systems is reliant on these long supply chains, right? So I actually think this is a great basis for a story, and you could take it into a food direction, which might be what Hannah's group is going to do. But you know, it might not be a good idea for the cities of the world to only have 3 days supply of food. Which most of them do. And if you think about how much infrastructure investment is it going to take to rebuild some of these supply chains versus the other investments that we're going to have to be making as a society. You know, I think this is a great, it's a fun one to imagine, and that you don't need very many dimensions in your story, right? You could just go tsunami, supply chain. What do we have that's locally produced? I mean, if you think about it, this spring, that's what we were all thinking about, just with one little pandemic, or at least we were in our community because we're kind of remote, and there were a lot of things that we couldn't, that we couldn't reliably get here. Right now, it's canning jar lids. We're all thinking about canning jar lids, but there's a lot of odd vulnerabilities. You know, sure, we all start to garden. We're all going to be worried about food security, and now we can't get canning jar lids. So it's a good basis for a story. So I'll just be quiet. Any other questions? Or comments or imaginings? So I was thinking, I mean, I know one group has set up a Slack channel. Is there a group, so say you wanted to just continue to work on this for the rest of class time. One person had raised the issue of a deadline on this. Given that they're one-page things, and I don't want you to agonize over them. So let me give you a worst case scenario so that you don't worry about getting something by next week. Okay. So worst case scenario, you write me something and I go, oh no, that's not going to work at all. What I will do, what I will do is say, can you change it this way? Okay. Just so that you have you know what's going to happen if I think you've messed up when you think you have done a fine job. So that'll be what'll happen. Is, can you change it this way? So I just wanted to say that. Now, in terms of getting you into your groups, one of you is already on a Slack channel, but that doesn't really get your face-to-face meetings. Who would like me to put you in to breakout rooms on the Zoom channel in your groups? And who would like to work? I'll just say that, because the alternative is you might use the rest of class time to work on something else, or you might arrange a different meeting. Who wants to go into their breakout rooms with the groups on the Zoom channel right now? Okay, so I will start, I'll just start putting you in there. Just going to pull up the group names because I kind of have to manually do it. So I'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll still be here until the end of class time. It's hard for me to know if, how you're calling me. So I'll be here, but probably not standing here while no one talks to me. So send me an email if you want me to either come to your group to chat or just answer a question, okay? So let me get going with the breakout rooms here.